I don't think it'd come as a shock to anyone for me to say that Zelda is my favorite series of all time. And looking at the most recent trailer of Breath of the Wild's sequel, I'm already extremely excited. The whole Sky Island type of fantastical setting has always been a major favorite of mine, so seeing a decent amount of focus on that in the sequel makes me very happy. And at the start, Breath of the Wild was no exception to this, with brilliant controls, gorgeous graphics, a super in-depth and intuitive physics system, and scope beyond belief. It really was a great experience when I first played it, with plenty of fond memories. But despite my enjoyment, when I finished the game, something just felt a little off. And it wasn't just as the credits were rolling, but somewhere along the way, that magic that I was feeling at the beginning was going away. With my 50th shrine, or 100th Korok seed, or millionth Bokoblin kill, or trillionth weapon drop. That is to say, I felt like my experience with the game peaked at the beginning several hours, and by the time I was halfway done, I felt like the game wasn't quite keeping up with me, in that I'd seen everything truly unique about the game already, despite not having explored nearly all of the world in its many facets. Now, even half of a Breath of the Wild playthrough is an impressive 50-ish hours, so it's hard to complain, but when the intrigue gets used up before the end, exploring the huge world felt less and less like a survival adventure, and more like a hike. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because, hikes are fun. But it didn't end up scratching that certain itch for me, as once you get enough materials to where survival is no longer really an issue, the game's surprises and rewards start feeling much less fulfilling, and everything starts to feel less like an adventure. I think the freedom aspect of the game is very impressive and is probably good enough for a lot of people to scratch that adventure itch. But for my personal tastes, freedom of exploration isn't necessarily what makes an adventure as much as it is what you're exploring and what you get out of it. The reward system and ways that you explore the world didn't take very long to feel very repetitive. That's sort of the main thesis of my gripes with this game. Repetition. But in my original script, I think I focused a bit too much on my complaints of Breath of the Wild. I have plenty of complaints and I stand by them. But I don't want this video to be a critique of Breath of the Wild as much as I want it to be a way to look forward to the coming sequel. I will still touch on my gripes, but that's mostly just as a point of reference, as those gripes are the main source of my wishes for the sequel, so it's unavoidable. But despite the fact that this video will be a bit more negative towards Breath of the Wild, I do want everyone to know that I do think it's a great game, and I did have a really good time with it. But I just think it had a lot of areas that could be way better, and the sequel is the perfect opportunity for it. And also, given the Zelda series' proclivity to shake things up with each edition, it's possible that approaching this through the lens of Breath of the Wild is already not the best way to handle this. But I at least think the core idea of exploration and freedom with a large world will be somewhat echoed in the sequel, which is where my list comes into play. If you want more in-depth thoughts on Breath of the Wild, you can go watch Mockrock's retrospective, link down below. It's long, but it covers the general idea of what I also thought was missing in the game, and also what I thought the game did well. But for this video, let's look forward and finally get into a list of ways I hope Breath of the Wild sequel will be able to take an already great game and make it even better. Items are a staple of Zelda games, as they serve as a means to reward the player for advancing in a dungeon or finding a secret, and they add a new gameplay element to shake up the content loop and grow your character. Now granted, some games handle items in their diverse use better than others, but their mere existence is a common ground for the series. What I'm hoping for in Breath of the Wild sequel is more diversity in this regard. Breath of the Wild did something very impressive and unique, in giving you all of the necessary tools to beat the game and explore mostly every part of the world right off the start. But going forward, I think more development later on would be better. Now there's two ways items could be added after the beginning section, in ways that add substantial gameplay changes. The first manner is adding a gameplay mechanic that changes how you interact with the world without making the world require this mechanic for exploration. My thumbnail photo is what I thought to be the perfect example of this, thank you Crim for creating it for me. Yes, the famous hookshot item, which was planned for Breath of the Wild, but scrapped for reasons I kinda don't want to get into. Picture this, you can use the hookshot item to latch onto and be pulled to any climbable wall, within a certain distance. Once pulled to it, you'll enter the climbing position. And from there, you can either climb as normal, or even jump off again, enter bullet time, and use the hookshot again to create a much more efficient yet player-involved climbing routine. Not only would this provide a unique development to the dull task of climbing, but it could even be used to combat Raighne, as you'd be able to just hookshot up the wall. Now, whether or not this idea works in Breath of the Wild sequel depends entirely on the world design and design philosophy of that game, but I'm primarily using it as an example of how an item could be used to shake up gameplay without gatekeeping exploration, as all this does is take an already existing mechanic and just make it a little bit more interesting. Another example could be a fishing rod of sorts. You know, for a game with such a focus on nature and survival, Breath of the Wild's lack of fishing really surprised me. I mean, it was kind of funny to kill fish with bombs and whatnot, but it just didn't scratch that fishing itch. So what if you could get a fishing rod item? You could still kill fish on the surface as normal, but with the fishing rod you could catch fish that reside deeper underwater. New fish that you couldn't see before. These fish could be used for side quests, or perhaps to cook certain meals, though I'll rant about the cooking system later. Now, I'm not a game designer, so I can't really think about the full impact items like these would have on the game at large, but I would think pretty minimal. And regardless, I'm just primarily trying to give an example of ways I think a game focused around exploration and freedom could still provide new gameplay elements without destroying that freedom. Also, there's the cool bike at the end of the DLC, which does this too. But I kinda didn't want to play through all the DLC for this video, and it feels kinda weird talking about the DLC because I'm kinda hoping these types of world-filling content aren't locked behind a $20 paywall that doesn't even get released immediately. But that's neither here nor there. And of course, the other approach to items in a Zelda game is, well, how they've always done it, with a pseudo-Metroidvania approach, where some of the things on the side that you can do may require a revisit after you've acquired a certain item or ability. Some would say that exploring a new area only to find that you can't completely explore after a certain part would be disappointing and ruin the point of exploration and freedom that Breath of the Wild was trying to establish. I kinda get it, but it's not like this is absent from Breath of the Wild. Here in my new playthrough to get footage for this video, I had gone through this really neat enemy gauntlet in the forest that I happened to wander into. Something I didn't really get to experience my first time playing because I unfortunately got here later in that playthrough, thus stripping it of any challenge or intrigue. And at the end of the gauntlet, I remembered that you can't access the shrine without Ferocious scale. Sure, the enemy loot was nice to make me stronger, you know, again only because I got here earlier rather than later. And the chest at the end had 300 rupees, which is something. But if this were my first time playing, I wouldn't even know what Feroce is or how to unlock this area. So basically, in order to make full use of this area that I did a lot of stuff to explore and reach, I needed a certain collectible that, if I were new to the game, I'd have no idea what is or how to get. To me, this is just a more bland version of blocking off something until you get a certain ability. Again, pseudo-Metroidvania-ish. Now, perhaps this isn't the best example because maybe people were bummed out by this specific type of instance. But for me personally, I actually kinda like this idea. I just think it should and could be made better if, instead of being locked off by a basic collectible, parts get locked off by items, and thus game-changing abilities. Let's say hypothetically you get here, and you find some type of shrine-like thing. Maybe not even a shrine, just a fast travel system, or some kind of neat collectible or whatever. But there's this door in the back that can only be opened by, say, hitting a switch with a magic hammer item or whatever, you know? This door could either lead to a mini dungeon, a little boss room, or just some super basic but super useful collectible. The advantage of this is that the game could build some anticipation if you happen to discover it early, as you have no idea what's behind it, and it's gotta be important, right? And if this hypothetical magic hammer is a bit difficult or time consuming to get, then any content locked behind it can be balanced more appropriately, since you wouldn't be able to get to it immediately. I think this would allow for proper growth and intrigue throughout the game, without really changing the core exploration element, at least as we've seen in Breath of the Wild. Now obviously based on how I talked about these things, you probably know which route I'd prefer, but honestly I think either way is fine, be it items that merely shake up gameplay but don't block anything behind them, or items that provide more substantial gameplay and are needed for certain parts of the world. Either way, I'm just hoping for more item diversity throughout the progression to help shake things up. Given the latest trailer of the game, we do see some items used, like a time shift thing, or a flamethrower, or something that makes Link go through land or whatever that is. But at the moment, it's hard to say whether these will be provided in the same way as the runes in Breath of the Wild, or if you find them throughout your playthrough. But I do think Link's hand thing has great potential, so I'm very excited. I want to preface this section by saying that I think the combat featured in Breath of the Wild is my favorite form of combat in this series. The parry mechanic alone is infinitely satisfying to master, and the headshot addition to archery alongside gyroscopic aiming make using the bow extremely satisfying too. The major form of discussion that usually follows this is in weapon durability, but for me this isn't my main focus of this section. Granted, I have plenty of issues with the durability system, especially since I think the supposed weapon variety you're encouraged to make use of due to this system's existence is hardly as varied as people make it out to be. But no, really, the thing about combat that I'm most hoping for going forward is the variety of what you're fighting. The enemies that do exist in Breath of the Wild are incredibly designed with really impressive AIs. I remember looking at these bokoblin hunt a boar and then celebrate killing it and then eating its meat. It's really fascinating. And a handful of the enemies, actually scratch that, one of the enemies is always a treat to fight even in late game. The issue is that the enemy diversity is way too low. Even under normal Zelda game circumstances the diversity is low, but for a game as huge as Breath of the Wild, it's not great. So basically I'm hoping for more enemy diversity in the sequel. A lot more. In the trailer we see the same usual goon squad that we had in Breath of the Wild, though with fashionably new horns. But we also get a look at a potential new enemy or boss type through the form of this machine and this squiggly dude. It's already a good start, but I don't think just adding in a handful of new enemies would be enough, if they intend to keep the world size similarly massive. I believe we need a lot more enemies, with a lot more attack patterns and methods of defeating them. Considering combat is like the number 2 focus of the game, outside just walking around like a goofy little guy, and I think it only makes sense to increase the things that you can, combat. I have less specific suggestions on this front, as what sort of enemies they could add to the sequel to increase diversity depends entirely on the settings they decide to go with and the items they implement. But to even spitball some old Zelda enemy ideas, Dark Notes could be extremely fun with more involved combat, perhaps regarding timing and positioning and such. And maybe they could even guard some ruins or hidden areas, and you have to beat them in order to get the treasure. Then you'd have these really freaky monsters like Redeads, or Gibdos, or Wallmasters, or Poes, who usually provide a lot of punch from their presence. And then you got other things like Dodongos, Skulltulas, Tektites, honestly the list could go on. But it also doesn't really matter how many different enemies they add if they can all be equally defeated by just shooting them in the face with arrows. So I think it'd be cool if they add more combat options too, or at least design these new enemies around more unique attack methods. In Breath of the Wild, combat variety really isn't a concern at the start, considering how many different ways you can usually approach taking out an enemy camp, especially in order to preserve your own weapons. But considering the enemy's health scales throughout the game alongside your weapons, but not alongside those more unique environmental factors, later into the game, combat is almost exclusively using your basic weapons, outside of very few exceptions. This means that later into the game, enemies just end up being mash the swing button until their massive amounts of health are gone, in my experience. Or just shooting them in the face. So for the sequel, I think it'd be pretty cool if they added new combat techniques that you could learn throughout the game, and then implement in battle. Similar to how Minish Cap or Twilight Princess handled them. Perhaps even the Fatal Blow can make a return in a more unique way, whether or not you learn it or you just know it, So for enemies that have way more health, they can still encourage using environmental factors. Not to deal damage, but to get them into position to use the Fatal Blow. Though that's mostly just spitballing. Also, this is just a very quick side note, but I do think they should rethink how you heal in this game. I think it's kinda weird that you can eat as much as you need to whenever you want. It didn't take long for this to trivialize battles, as once I got hit once, I could just scarf down my abundance of food before hopping right back in. It kinda broke the flow. But I will say, enemy diversity is the major point here. As long as they spice up what we're fighting and how in some way, I think that'll be perfect. Now, you can't talk about Zelda without bringing up dungeons, especially considering how much dungeons tie into the 2 previous points, as dungeons are the prime location in which you get some new tool to use, both in said dungeon and typically outside as well. On top of this, dungeons are full to the brim of enemies to fight off, with potentially a mini-boss of sorts, and always a cool final boss, whose design usually makes good and creative use of whatever new item you got in said dungeon. I feel like I don't have to go super in depth about how these things were missing from Breath of the Wild, as that's a topic that's been talked to death. But furthermore, I want to focus on one aspect that I don't see a lot of people really pin down. Something that was especially missing from Breath of the Wild that most other dungeons in the past did super well. That is atmosphere. Normally when talking about Zelda dungeon designs, the topic that gets brought up is their structure. If you've seen Game Maker's Toolkit in their Boss Keys series, you'll know what I mean by that. In that regard, I don't really have a preference between puzzle box dungeons and more linear ones, and ideally, I think a good Zelda game should have a combination of the two. But what matters more to me in a dungeon is usually how it makes me feel. Its atmosphere, its tone, its lore, its music, everything tied together. These are what made certain Zelda dungeons stick out to me more than other locations in any other game I've experienced. And I think this is especially important if the dungeon's design wants you to think spatially. It's easier to have spatial thinking if you're immersed, and it's easier to be immersed if the place looks cool. Let me give you an example. Ocarina of Time, to me, still has the best overall dungeon selection to this day. The two examples I'll bring up are the Water Temple and the Shadow Temple, back-to-back dungeons. The Water Temple is a complicated puzzle box involving the levels of water that affect the entire dungeon, forcing you to really think about every moving part. People clearly have their opinions on this layout. Personally, I think the 3DS remake did all it had to fix these issues, so I like it. Beside this, though, is the atmosphere. I don't even know how I would describe it, really. It's just the water dungeon. A blue glow covers the whole place, with signs of temple-like structures, engineering. And even the Shadow Link fight arena looks absolutely tremendous. You know, assuming you're not using the version on the Switch's N64 pass. Then go to the Shadow Temple. This dungeon, in contrast, is far more linear, to the point where it's less about thinking about where to go, and more about getting through each individual room. Far more simple, far less thinking, and yet, the Shadow Temple is probably my favorite Zelda dungeon of all time. Why? The item you get in there is pretty cool, but it's not a huge game changer, and the layout doesn't require much mental processing. The reason is that atmosphere. This dungeon is something I'm not entirely sure any other Zelda game is going to even be allowed to do again. It's dark, scary, full of lore and thematic hints that change your perspective of the world around you. It feels real in the world, being an underground torture dungeon of a tribe serving the royal family during a civil war. War is never a pretty thing, and more often than not, in war, no one comes out of it the good guy. And to see a location like this in an otherwise more innocent, adventure-like game has always stuck with me for my entire life. The soundtrack accompanying it is genuinely scary too. When I was younger, I couldn't even listen to the song alone because I get way too freaked out. Now obviously I'm not trying to say that every dungeon should be a Shadow Temple. If anything, that defeats the point of what I'm trying to say. I'm mostly just trying to say that, for me, a dungeon's biggest drawing point is its atmosphere and purpose. To the point where dungeons with completely different design philosophies can still stick with me so well. On the contrary, Breath of the Wild shrines and divine beasts not only look identical to each other, but you know exactly why they're all there. There's no mystery or intrigue. Sure, this makes more sense from my lore perspective, for these Sheikah-made things to have challenges and puzzles for the hero, compared to some random ruins far away. But for me, this is hardly a good trade. My general thoughts are just that I want more traditional Zelda dungeons in all manners, but that's a bit more vague. So my more specific and unique opinion is just that I want all the dungeons in Breath of the Wild sequel to have personality. A lot of it. I don't think atmosphere carries a dungeon, as there's plenty of games whose dungeons have hardly any immersion, but are still fun to traverse. But I will say, in my experience, those dungeons never really stick in my memory quite as well as those with atmosphere, so I still think it's an incredibly important aspect. Everything I've mentioned before is very important for me in harnessing that feeling of adventure. Cool items to find that make you feel like you've grown stronger to shake up gameplay. Cool enemy diversity to keep the gameplay loop interesting and to test those new skills. And cool dungeons to reward you for exploration and to give you an awesome spectacle with good challenge and reward. But despite how much those aspects are important to me, this section is probably the sole section that, if it were adjusted in Breath of the Wild, I'd have nearly no complaints. And that is how the game rewards you. I feel like a lot of the game's reward system is built around the survival aspect of the game, which obviously makes sense. But what this means is that these rewards only really matter as long as you're struggling to survive. Since it doesn't take that long to be loaded with all the items you'd ever need, this leads to a lot of the exploration and rewards feeling more redundant and useless than interesting and satisfying. This is why the first several hours of any playthrough are really fun, since everything I get is vital to my survival and is thus very fulfilling. But by the time food and weapons are of zero issue, which again doesn't take very long, having those be used as rewards starts failing. The only other type of real reward outside of mainline quest stuff comes in the form of Korok seeds and shrines. Now, I really do think these are a great idea, but when all the other reward types become super redundant pretty quickly, having just these two reward types cover the rest of the game's exploration factor just led to, again, more redundancy. Especially when I personally felt pretty satisfied with my inventory space after only like 50 Korok seeds. This combined with how rupees aren't even that vital in the game, and can easily be obtained by selling a lot of your collectibles, some of which being their only real use, and considering how some of the chests may contain a weapon that you can't even hold, and may not even need in your inventory at that point. And at some point down the line, none of the game's rewards felt very satisfying to me, which is not good. Armor is a better example of rewards done right, with a permanent standing in your inventory, the ability to be upgraded, and sometimes died, both of which make very good use of materials. I do think some of the effects are a bit too simple with more overlap than I'd like, and upgrading your armor kinda breaks the game by making you nearly invincible, but overall I think armor is the best form of reward in the game right now. But for a game this size, obviously it'd take more than just one solid reward type to keep things interesting. The bottom line is, I want a more diverse spread of useful rewards for doing things. Side quests of any sort, or bombing a random wall out in the wild, or finding some cool ruins. A reward system that stays satisfying throughout the game. For some folk, finding another ore to just sell for rupees, or finding your 50th shrine or 200th Korok seed is good enough, as it's at least some sort of reward, and they're not completely useless. I fully respect and understand this, especially when sometimes the mere act of just experiencing something is reward enough. But for me personally, it usually wasn't enough. Items are one way to help this, as I mentioned in the first section, with things like a hookshot or a fishing rod or whatever. This could also be done in the form of a lower tier item, like empty bottles or a quiver expansion. And if they decide to implement some sort of appetite meter to prevent you from just eating to your heart's delight, or some other limiter to eating, they could then implement some sort of reward that boosts how much you can eat or whatever. Another example of a fun collectible could be seen in the gems from Phantom Hourglass. There's 3 types of gems, and there's 20 of each total throughout the game, and I think they're an awesome collectible. In order to make use of them, you need to discover a hidden island, which is already interesting in its own right. When you get 10 of one, you get a power-up, be it double damage, double resistance, or a sword beam, and when you get 20 of one, you can boost that power-up. Obviously, the exact numbers and effects should be tweaked to better fit the sequel, but still, it's an idea of a collectible that won't just break a few seconds later, and isn't the same thing you've been seeing over and over. It can even tie into the idea of combat upgrades I mentioned before. There's loads of other examples, some of which would require an overall fine-tuning to the game, like making rupees much more valuable and thus much more satisfying as a reward. They could also implement some sort of minor crafting system to make some materials like ores have better use. Perhaps there's some nice items that you can only get through crafting, or whatever. And thus being rewarded with said crafting materials feels better. And a big thing for me is cooking. Small rant, but I see people praise the cooking system in this game a lot. It was certainly a cool novelty, but I gotta say, the fact that basically everything you cook has the same general effect, that is healing hearts, and most of the unique effects are either just basic stat changes thanks to one ingredient, whose description leaves nothing to the imagination, or are just broken and thus don't incentivize using anything else, and I never found any reason to actually experiment. Why go out of my way to get the specific ingredients for a cake, when I could just throw in a bunch of meat or stuff that I easily got from exploration and achieve the same thing, if not even better? It always felt like a missed opportunity, and I never got the hype around it personally. It's a great concept, but does not have great execution. There's a Minecraft mod called Pam's Harvest Craft, and it adds a ton of ingredients and foods you can make. And there's a mod called Spice of Life, Carrot Edition or whatever, which rewards you for trying new foods in the way of increasing your permanent health in increments. Whenever I play a mod pack with these two mods, I'm always incentivized to try all the foods available, and to craft foods and all of that, which makes for a very pleasant collectible incentive. It makes it more rewarding when I find a new food or something. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that Breath of the Wild should function the same way. The balance and design philosophy between these games are very different. But the idea is that I wish there was an actual incentive to trying new foodstuffs, as currently that does not exist. Perhaps there could be a questline similar to the photo collection thing for making or eating a lot of foods, which has several rewards at certain milestones, similar to the golden skulltulas in Ocarina of Time. Something like this would make ingredients, foods, or the rupees to buy ingredients a bit more satisfying as a reward for exploration, and could allow for recipes for certain dishes to be used as a good reward too. Overall, I'm just hoping for more variety and use in the types of things I get rewarded with for doing a side quest, or discovering a cool location, an amount of things that actually suit the world's size and expected playtime, rather than... This is going to be a very short section, but nevertheless it is very important for me. But I would like a good final boss this time around. Pardon yet another rant here, but this is the worst thing in the game in my opinion. And I have to assume that this is a direct result of the developers being put under crunch time and having to just get the game out or whatever. Perhaps it's thematic for how you're going to fight the real Ganon in the sequel or something? I don't know, it still sucks. The fight before is... okay. I still think it's really bland compared to other final bosses, and the fact that doing all of the divine beasts halves the health of an already really easy boss isn't exactly something I love, but you could say there's something thematically cathartic about that. I mean, I don't like it, but this much is whatever. But this part, you had the perfect opportunity to do a true Shadow of the Colossus style final boss, with climbing and paragliding and tons of cool stuff out in the open world. And frankly, that should have been the bare minimum for a boss like this. Don't forget guys, this is Calamity Ganon, the source of the Great Calamity. You know, that absolutely tragic thing that happened 100 years ago, whose ruins and after effects you've been experiencing the whole game. This isn't just some normal final boss. This is something you've been acutely aware of for the entire game. And yet, the actual final boss is nothing more than a pleasant shooting gallery. Ganon's attacks never even thought about coming close to hitting me. And the targets are so generous that I don't think I actually had to use a single brain cell in the fight. This had the makings to be an absolutely phenomenal final boss, a culmination of all your skills you've honed since then. And yet it's gone as soon as it started. And okay, I'm going off script here, but I remember playing through the game, and Zelda said something about this being like Ganon giving up on reincarnation, or something like that. In my mind, that means this is like Ganon's final stand after millennia of reincarnating and fighting. That's pretty huge, and yet still the fight is like this? I don't know, that's just not good. Yes, that was a very negative rant, despite what I said in the intro, but I'm making an exception here because this is still something about the game that really bothered me. Considering how the game was already starting to feel a bit repetitive before I got to this point, ending it on a note like that didn't sit well with me. Endings really matter. So for the sequel, my sole request in this section is to just make a good final boss. Honestly, even a decent final boss would be a major step up. But I think that's everything I have to say. I ultimately decided to sacrifice thoroughness for the sake of clarity and a more forward-thinking attitude, which means there's a lot of topics I either didn't mention or didn't flesh out enough to make my points more reasonable. If I see any comments or remember anything important to bring up in that regard, I'll put something in the pinned comment, so go see that if you want to. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Tell me in the comments what you thought about any of these points, and what your 5 wishes are for the sequel, or anything along those lines. You know, usual YouTube comment stuff. And perhaps this list will be a lot more different after we see more trailers for the sequel and get a better idea for how they want to handle that game. I'm definitely curious about how well this is going to age. The Game Awards isn't too long after uploading this video, just a few weeks. Now, I'm not fully expecting it, but it's possible we'll get more Zelda info there. I mean, we've gotten 2 Smash reveals total at this event. I think it's possible to see other big Nintendo news, but we'll see. So I figure once we learn more about the sequel, I'll make a follow-up video. And of course, once the game actually releases, I intend to make a lot of content on it, if possible. I know this channel was founded on Smash Brothers, but if I'm gonna be real with y'all for a second, I don't see myself sticking with Smash Brothers for a very long time. And considering Zelda's my favorite series, and the format Breath of the Wild brought up makes for a lot of interesting content, especially random fact style content, I think I'll try to make a new base in that game once it's out. Just to give a heads up. I'm not sure if I'll completely abandon Smash, it depends on how successful the Zelda stuff is, but it definitely won't be the focus if I can help it. So considering that, any and all support on these non-Smash videos is more than appreciated. And on top of that support, I want to thank Skully, Burbo, Hobo King Niklz, Raighne, Silveron700, and all my patrons for their support. So thank you for watching, stay casual, and I'll see y'all later.